Hello everyone, I hope you can hear and see us, and welcome to the fourth and final instalment of this season of our online seminar series, What's Your Poison?, organised by the HERA-funded research project Intoxicating Spaces. And as always, it's great to see so many of you here. Today is opium, and we're delighted to have with us as our speaker Jim Mills. Jim is Professor of History at the University of Strathclyde. He teaches and researches in two main subject areas: the social history of drugs and narcotics and the social history of health and medicine in the British Empire. He's published widely on psychiatric institutions and encounters in colonial India and on the history of cannabis in Britain and its empire. And he's currently writing the history of cocaine consumption and control in Asia between 1900 and 1945 as part of a Wellcome Trust Investigator Award. Today, however, he's going to be discussing opiates in 18th century Scotland. So the man has range. Before we get going, our usual spot of housekeeping. Jim will speak for around half an hour, and then there'll be around half an hour for questions and discussion. There's a little chat feature in the bottom right, say something nice, where you're very welcome to post comments and observations throughout the talk. However, if you have a question for Jim, please post it using the separate Ask a Question button at the bottom. You can post these here as they occur to you throughout the talk. We'll save them until the Q&A. If you want me to ask the question on your behalf, simply type it out. However, if you'd rather ask the question yourself, just type question in the box or something to that effect, and I'll see if I can get you up onto the screen. But do be aware, however, that as ever, the event is being recorded. So without further ado, it gives me enormous pleasure to turn things over to Jim and Poppies, Opiates and Pain in Scotland, circa 1764 to 1785.
Smashing. Thank you very much, James. And good afternoon, everyone, from a chilly Glasgow. Needless to say, they seem to have come up with another platform for us to use. So this one's called Crowdcast. So please bear with me while I try and get my PowerPoint up on screen. But I should say that I imagine most of you will soon get bored of listening to me. So if the PowerPoint isn't up, then you're all very welcome to play Identify the Scottish Island on the picture behind me. All right, so I expect a sensible answer by the end of this session. Now, let's have a little look at sharing screens. Everybody had a look at the picture? Good, right. Let's share our screen. Hang on. That one. That one. You are screen sharing. Good. Can you all just somebody send me a message to make sure that you can see the PowerPoint? Is that a yes?
Yep, we can see it, Jim.
Lovely. Good. Right. There we go. Good. Okay, I've got about half an hour to blast through a lot of material. So if I start to go over, I'll cut myself off abruptly. What are we talking about today? Poppies, opiates and pain in early modern Scotland from 1664 to 1785. These are really the dates around the examples that I'll use. But broadly speaking, I hope to get away with making the argument that we're looking at poppies, opiates and pain in the early modern period, broadly defined. For those of you who are interested in reading this paper in full, the happy news is that it's just been accepted for publication in the Social History of Alcohol and Drugs and will appear at some point next year. So please, by all means, keep an eye out for that and get back to me. I should also mention that the material I'm using today is part of a much larger project. The much larger project has the title Before Heroin, Dangerous Drugs in Scotland, 1664 to circa 1980. But I'm still having an argument with the publishers, McGill Queen's, about whether this should be called Before Train Spotting, Dangerous Drugs in Scotland, 1664 to circa 1980. So again, any thoughts on that, I would very much welcome. At this point, I should acknowledge the Wellcome Trust, who have very graciously funded most of my research now over the last 5 years. And this book is very much based on research that I shouldn't have been doing on their time. As James said earlier, I should have been writing a book about cocaine in Asia, but I got distracted. Okay, and I should just add, don't everybody doze off. If you're worried that I'm going to be channeling Virginia Berridge over the next half an hour, it's more likely I'm channeling Nigella Lawson, as we're going to be talking about various recipes in the next 25 minutes. So let's get cracking.
Sorry to interrupt you. Before you get going, can you just share the full screen by going to slideshow, start slideshow, and the slides will be up there.
Booby shot me, James. Got it? Good.
Not just yet. It's still showing. Click from beginning again.
There. How's that?
No, for some reason it's not showing the full slides. We can see them, but it's just the outline. Don't worry. In the replay, I'll cut all this out. So just try again.
Okay. Let's have a little look.
And then show.
Hang on then. Right, here we go. The problem seems to be that I need to escape in order to bring back up the...
Okay, yep, that's fine. Go with that. Don't worry, when I sort of download this for YouTube, we'll cut all this out.
All right.
So yeah, just try and then start screen sharing again.
Yeah, hang on then. Share screen. And we want Opium Scotland. We want to allow it. And then we want to do it from the beginning. How's that?
Yeah, it's still just sort of showing the outline view. Just try once more to go from beginning.
Yeah.
If that doesn't work, we're just going to have to go with as it is at the moment.
So that's what I've got it full screen now.
Oh, right. It's still just showing the outline. Sorry, folks. We're going to just have to go with the outline version, I think. Yep. Carry on, Jim. Cheers. Sorry.
Right. Okay. So there's our questions. When were opium preparations first used in Scotland? What were poppy medicines and what were they used for? Now, the whole project came from a eureka moment when I was sat there teaching, and as one does, in the middle of a seminar, my mind wandered. And I happened to have a look at the book that we were all having a big discussion about today, which, of course, is Virginia Berridge's Opium and the People. And it was an odd moment because, of course, I work at a university based in Scotland, and the group I was teaching was in Shanghai. So maybe it was this combination of factors meant that I suddenly noticed the title of Virginia's book, which, of course, I owe a great deal to and have been using for the best part of 20 years. And the full title, of course, is Opium and the People, Opiate Use and Drug Control Policy in 19th Century England. And I'd never noticed the England. I guess if I'd ever given it any thought, my assumption had always been that it was Britain. But have a look at it for yourselves. The title very definitely says 19th century England. And it was one of those moments when I began to think, well, hang on, what about Scotland? And part of the reason I thought about this was because, of course, Scotland has a very different legal system, very different educational system, has a rich scientific and medical history of its own, has its own history of religious and moral divisions. So I began to wonder whether there was something to be done here. There was work to be written about the history of dangerous drugs in Britain, but from Scottish archives. That's the origin of the Before Heroin or Before Train Spotting project, and certainly explains why I'm looking at opium rather than cannabis or cocaine, which are my previous projects, and why I'm particularly focusing on Scotland, and particularly on early modern Scotland, because in some ways Virginia's book title was missing a trick, because she, of course, uses Scottish examples, and provides a decent sense of what was happening around Britain and in Scotland during the 19th century, which explains the date range of today's paper. I began to wonder what others had published on opium before the 19th century, which Virginia had been obviously drawn on, which explained why she had focused on the 19th century. Anyway, the short and tall of it all is there isn't much published on the use of opium in early modern British medicine. There's plenty of speculation about the place of opium in intellectual discussions and the place of opium texts in university libraries, but not so much on the use of opium medicines in early modern Britain. So, if you like, by focusing on Scottish archives, I think what I'm trying to do is fill in or address what seems to me to be a real absence here of sensible research into opium in early modern Britain. Right, that's me explaining the project. Let's get down to some recipes. So, when were opium preparations first used in Scotland? What were poppy medicines and what were they used for? Now, the handsome fella in the painting is the Earl of Glenorchy, Sir John Campbell. And in amongst his papers at the National Archives of Scotland, one can find a bill from Dr. John Murray. John Murray was an apothecary based in Edinburgh, and the bill in question covers the period from February 1664 to January 1665. So in other words, it's an invoice for the previous years for the medicines that the estate had purchased. Now,
Jim, sorry to interrupt you again. The slides aren't advancing on the screen on our screen. Lovely, that's better. Cheers, thank you.
Got it. Yeah. All right. So what we see is that the Earl of Glenorchy's estate was buying laudanum between February, March, and April of 1664, and it paid £2 for 10 grains. Now, because time's marching on, I'll try to keep this short, but I'm going to read just for a moment to make sure that I get all this right. So, the Laird of Glenorchy was one of Scotland's most powerful nobles of the 17th century in Scotland. The invoice shows that on a monthly basis, the household could order anything between 2 and 18 different products. The opium that he ordered was actually a laudanum, which of course is a tincture of opium, and it was often deployed for its constipating effects and also to reduce pain or to encourage sleep. The 3 batches ordered in relatively rapid succession, followed by the disappearance of laudanum from the shopping list, points to a bout of digestive orders that eventually passed. Laudanum, in this case at least, seems to have been used to deal with a particular episode of ill health, rather than as a stock substance kept on the premises and doled out routinely. Now, the laudanum provided does not appear to be exorbitantly expensive when compared to other items on the list. 10 grains of the substance cost £2, the same as materials for emulsions, whatever they were, and a little cheaper than a batch of cinnamon. But it does appear that the laudanum ordered was rather more expensive than the order for, and there's the exact words or symbols there, SYR : papaver erat. Now, the order for that, 6 bottles cost £5 and 12 shillings. The order for the SYR, which I've read as syrup, for the syrup of papaver erat, mixed with the other ingredients, was placed on the 19th of March. So well within the framework of this stomach disorder that I think we've identified for laudanum in February, March, and April. And of course, the syrup of papaver erat. Well, papaver erat is 17th century apothecary speak for wild poppies, the red types that grow in British fields and hedgerows from springtime onwards. It's now called papaver rhoeadine, so in other words, red poppy. And interestingly, we now know that the plant contains alkaloids that can be used for analgesic sedation purposes, but which lack the potency of codeine and morphine, which are found in white poppy or papaver somniferum. For example, the alkaloid rhoeadine acts on at least 3 opioid receptors in the human body, and therefore can be considered an opiate, although of course nobody used that term in the early modern period. So the argument that I'm trying to make here is that the Earl of Glenorchy's household, Sir John Campbell's household, was buying 2 sorts of poppy preparation during what appears to be a short-lived health crisis early in 1664. It's buying laudanum, which is a tincture of prepared white opium, but is also buying syrup of white poppies, 6 bottles, no less, which would themselves have contained small traces of rhoeadine, which is in itself an analgesic which acts on opioid receptors, albeit in ways that are nowhere near as powerful as other opiates such as morphine and codeine. Now, I've got a big long argument there about why they may have been buying a much weaker analgesic for their children, but you'll have to read the paper because I don't have time to go through it. One type of evidence that I've been exploring is the bills and invoices of the landed gentry during this period, but the National Archive of Scotland and the Edinburgh University Library also contain all sorts of family records from well-to-do families. And these show that you've got handwritten recipes here. So these show families collecting useful remedies, sometimes over the course of decades, and in a couple of examples across the centuries, in which they're recording what they're putting in to these therapeutic substances made at home. So, for example, we've got the Clark family of Penicuik. Now, theirs is by far the most extensive collection of these medical recipes. Let me have a quick look. Where are they? Right, there we go. Now, the Clark's family seems to range from 1666, when the first of these recipes is dated, through to the end of the 18th century. The last entry that's dated is for a medicine to deal with kidney stones. Tucked away in there, I think it's paper number 26, is a recipe for syrup of poppies. And this, let me just work through this for you from the text so I don't make a mess of it. John Clark, the Clark family were all descended from a merchant who made his fortune trading in France in the 1650s, and successive generations established themselves in Scotland as active members of the country's political and business elites. There are 83 recipes for medicines and therapeutic concoctions in this bundle, one of which is our syrup of poppies. It's neatly written on a scrap of paper and unfolds to reveal the recipe, but sadly there's no date on this, so we can't be sure about exactly when this recipe was first written down. The recipe reads, take white poppy heads, dried and free of seeds, 7 ounces, cut the heads small and boil them in 6 English pints of water, stirring them often till only 1/3 of the water remains, which will be almost entirely soaked up with the poppies. Then strongly press out the liquor and boil it down slowly to about 1/2 pint. Strain it whilst hot through a fine woolen cloth and boil it with 12 ounces of fine sugar, slowly till it weighs about 18 ounces. Do not cork it till it is cold, if you're planning on doing this at home, and let it stand very still. Now, while it's undated, another one of the bundle's contents hints at why the family might have been keen to keep such a recipe to hand. A printed advertisement, which is on there on the screen, had the title, "The Method of Curing the Smallpox," first written in the year 1704 for the use of the noble and honourable family of March by Dr. Archibald Pitcairn. Now, smallpox was one of the great horrors of the period, of course, and historians have suggested that in the 18th century, the disease accounted for up to 15% of all deaths in Europe, with 80% of the victims being under the age of 10. Pitcairn's detailed instructions for treating smallpox was almost entirely related to children, unsurprising given that smallpox was particularly fatal in the young. His regime started with the use of lock leeches for bleeding the victim as soon as symptoms appeared, which could also include loss of appetite, drowsiness, a fever, or a cough. And I'll quote, "Meantime, give the child a spoonful of syrup of white poppies at night, and in the night time till sleep or ease comes." It was his advice for helping the patient get some rest. But once the fever passed and the pox or swellings began to appear, a handful of sheep's pearls was to be steeped in purified water, sweetened with syrup of red poppies. At night, the white poppy was to be administered again. And around the 8th day, a crucial moment came. The child was to drink barley water sweetened with the syrup of white poppies. This will make the child spit, which saves the child. In the event that the child once again remained ill, stop it with syrup of poppies and 5 or 7 drinks of liquid laudanum, given now and then till it be stopped. Should the swellings prematurely disappear, treat with white poppies and diascordium. Diascordium could also contain opiates, and diascordium and white poppy syrup were to be included. So we start to get to see how multiple opium preparations were being recommended for one of the big killers of the age by one of the leading doctors of the period, because of course Pitcairn was a founding member of the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh, and he was appointed Professor of Medicine at Edinburgh University during his career. So here we've got a sense that we've got a family making syrups of poppies, and then you can trace this through the batch to find a direct link to medical practice. So they seem to be making their own concoctions and then following a course of treatment recommended by Pitcairn, using syrups of both red and white poppy and laudanum, and maybe even an opium-based diascordium. Where does that all get us? Well, I thought this was interesting. This one can be found in the Murray family's collection, which is more narrowly dated to the 1730s. This is a recipe to make poppy cordials, which, and there's a little note at the bottom, states that this is very good for any disorder in the stomach. Take 2 gallons of brandy. Now, if any of you are thinking of preparing any of these for Christmas, I think this one sounds particularly Christmassy. To make, take 2 gallons of brandy, a peck of corn poppies, which is another word for red poppies, pick them clean from the stalks, steep them in your brandy for 2 or 3 days, take an ounce of mace, an ounce of cloves, an ounce of nutmegs, pin bruise them, and put them in a little plain brandy to steep. Take mint, balm, angelica, and cardamom, of each one handful, distill them with the poppies. When strained from the brandy, together with the spices, mix the produce with the brandy the poppies were steeped in. Add this to 2 pounds of double refined sugar, and when the sugar is dissolved, bottle it up. Good stuff for after Christmas dinner, I imagine. So, this adds to the picture that we've got Scottish households making syrups from both red and white poppies, and we've got a good sense of why they're doing so. Finally, I'll just mention Tipper Mullock's receipts, which I assume most early modernists will be familiar with, just because it's brilliant. Tipper Mullock's receipts was first published in 1712, and I'll put both the titles of both early editions down there for you. Tipper Mullock's receipts was published in 1712, was a collection of many useful and easy remedies for most distempers, written by John Moncrieff. Now, Moncrieff is an interesting chap. He was a doctor who worked in Scotland and lived into his 80s, which very few men do in Scotland these days. So I imagine that was a considerable achievement. back in the 18th century. Where's he gone? Here he is. And then such was the success of his first edition that if you like, the follow-up, the expanded edition, came within 5 years. As you can see, The Poor Man's Physician followed this in 1716. But I think this is a particularly interesting book because there's a focus here on self-help. This isn't necessarily something for the guidance only of the elite households of the period. The Poor Man's Physician, as the title suggests, is a choice collection of simple and easy remedies for most distempers, very useful for all persons, especially those of a poorer condition. Right, what does he make of it all? Now, the first edition, poppy-based medicines are only mentioned twice. In the first instance, it's mentioned for dealing with, what was it called? Frenzy, which I can talk about a bit more if anybody's interested in questions. And secondly, poppy medicines were recommended for a canker in the dugs, which I've discovered. Canker usually means ulcers, and dugs usually means female breasts. So this seems to have been a remedy particular for women. For the canker, it was recommended to prepare water of red poppy, plantis and roses, to be mixed with honey and roses. This was simply to be applied to the ulcers. And again, this kind of makes sense when you think about it. The use of the local red poppy would certainly have ensured that this was an inexpensive concoction to put together, because the local red poppy was available locally wild at certain times of the year. And the various constituent parts made a certain sense, as honey and roses have long been considered anti-inflammatory, while the extract from the red poppies would have been mildly analgesic. In the second edition, there's a significant expansion of opium-based remedies in the pages of the book. The entry on canker in the dogs was still there. That on frenzy had been expanded. Gout in the feet was included. And if you have gout, then you could have taken 1 dram of opium pulverized with saffron, yolks of eggs and oil of roses. And this sounds significantly easier to swallow than another of the possible remedies for gout, which was goat's dung mixed with swine's seam. Cureth the gout, asserted the book. Swine seam, of course, is pig fat. Laudanum was included in the book for the first time. One recommendation was laudanum anointed multiplieth hair, which is simple. And for those of us of a certain age, this is probably worth looking into. And at the other end of the body is the slightly mystifying entry that I've included at the bottom there. Dioscorides saith, laudanum put in, emplastered and suffumigate heateth much, an overmoist and cold mother. Wherefore it is said with the smell thereof to beget children with the chaste. I hope the early modernists out there will contact me with what precisely they think this technique might have consisted of. By the end of the 1780s, you get a letter like this, which I include just really out of interest. And it may or may not be central to the discussion we're going to talk about in a minute. James Campbell was a doctor who went on to work for the East India Company in India, of course. And he wrote to his brother, Alexander Campbell, his brother-in-law, Alexander Campbell of Barcaldine, about the health of his sister sometime in the late 1780s. Now, it's unclear what precisely is wrong with his sister, Jean, but she, if I included the full discussion here, it becomes clear that she's either, she's pregnant, I think. So, and James Campbell writes, look, Jean wrote her mother, desiring to know whether she might try opium. This certainly will give temporary relief, but it is a bad practice. For if once begun, it will be found necessary to continue it if opium can be dispensed with. It will be much better, but when the pains are very troublesome, she may be allowed a small quantity. You may mix an equal quantity of the tincture of opium and of the spirits of lavender, suppose an ounce of each, and give her 60 drops, which make 30 of laudanum. You may increase it if necessary. But again, I think it's very interesting, this sentence. This certainly will give temporary relief, but it is a bad practice. So if once begun, it will be found necessary to continue it. Suggests that by this time, the clouds are starting to gather around opium-based medicines. And certainly gives a hint here that the doctor is anxious or uneasy about the idea that once you start using opium, then it will be found necessary to continue with it, which suggests again that the habit-forming properties of certain opium-based substances were starting to be acknowledged by Scottish doctors in the period. Right, to some conclusions. The full paper from which these examples that I have hastily rushed through were apart point me in these 5 directions, which I look forward to discussing with you. Conclusion number 1 answers our first question. Opium medicines were consumed in Scotland since at least the 1660s. There's some evidence that these things are being mentioned as early as the late 16th century in correspondence between doctors. But it's not really until this point in the 17th century, I argue, that we can find evidence of opium medicines in practice in Scotland. And I should just add, I suppose, that I see Scotland not as some peripheral backwater in this period. I see Scotland very much as a stand-in for early modern Europe. Scotland was very well connected with Europe through trade and through intellectual links and through intertravel. So, I see Scotland very much as standing in for early modern Europe in wider discussions. The second conclusion that I reached was that medicines that I've talked about today were based on both imported white and local red poppies. This is important in itself, but it allows me to draw another couple of conclusions that answered questions 2 and 3 that we posed earlier. White poppies and red poppies were used alongside one another for most of the early modern period in Scotland. There's no evidence that the white poppy medicines are supplanting the red poppy medicines. Instead, what seems to be happening is that the exotic white poppy medicines were being adopted and adapted by those who were used to working with preparations from the red ones. Now, there's simply not enough research been done on the use of opium in medieval British medicine for us to say this with any certainty. But I think the argument that I'm working my way towards is that red poppy medicines, being based on local plants, are likely to have been used regularly in Scotland before the white poppy substances turned up. So the argument I think I'm making is that the doctors and apothecaries and druggists in this period were used to working with the mild poppy analgesics to be obtained from red poppies rather. So when the white poppies began to be introduced into Scotland in the 17th century, they were viewed less as exotic imports, which is something that historians like Shivelbush and Courtwright and Jordan Goodman and others have argued. And instead they're seen simply as stronger versions of the red poppy, which physicians and apothecaries and druggists and so on are used to working with. And therefore they integrate white poppy substances into their routine practices and indeed into their new medicines alongside red poppies, being keenly aware of the difference in potency between the common local red poppy and the imported white one. And finally, I'm conscious that we need time for discussion, so I'll just leave you with this final point. That again, the Shivelbushes and the Courtwrights and the Goodmans and so on have tended to argue that substances like opium poppies and indeed opium poppies themselves were quickly adapted for pleasure rather than for medicinal uses. I've not found any evidence of this in early modern Scotland. In fact, the first discussion of what appears to be a market developing for a recreational or a non-medical use of laudanum doesn't come until the 1820s in the discussion of poisoning cases. So there's my final point, and I look forward to taking questions, that poppy substances for 200 years in Scotland were used for pain and not pleasure. Thank you very much.
Jim, that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. So provocative and clear. And apologies for the slight gremlins affecting the slides, but we got there in the end. I've got sort of so many questions myself, but I see we've already got one in the box. So I'll start sort of straight away with that. This is from R. Del Rio, who asks, thanks for the interesting talk. Could you elaborate on access to these medicines? Listening to the ingredients, they seem to be quite expensive, and I'm curious to know how common consumption of these remedies was. Were they crafted exclusively by educated professionals for elite consumption, or were they more widespread?
Yeah, of course there's a difficulty in trying to establish exactly who can afford this, and also following Patrick Wallace's work about 10 years ago, when Patrick was trying to work out the prices of substances like opium based on his research in, I think it was 18th century London. It's incredibly difficult to put your finger on exactly how prices fluctuated and whether it was a story over the course of this period of ever increasing amounts, meaning ever decreasing prices and so on. But I think there's a couple of points to that. I haven't got the details to hand, or I would bore everybody by going through the details. But I think what I've done is I've shown that white poppy substances tend to be a similar price to other imports in this period. So imports like cinnamon. I seem to remember spending a day trying to track cinnamon prices across these apothecary bills, and licorice prices, which seem to become these imported medicines that begin to grow in popularity across the 17th century. So it's if you like, it's an unsatisfactory answer, but the opium doesn't seem to be any more or less expensive than other imported medicines during this time. I would also point out that it's not just price that dictates who gets to use it, because there's evidence, which I discuss in the full paper, of if you like, the Scottish household may buy medicines, but it's not simply for the aristocratic members of that household, and that being a member of the household entitled you, if you like, it was one of the perks of the job to if you're a member of the household, if you're a scullery maid, or if you're an agricultural worker, or if you're looking after the horses, then if you become ill, then you're granted access to the estate medicines. So there's at least one route there by which the non-elites may have found themselves treated with opium medicines. And as I say, I think Tipper Mullock's recipes at the beginning of the 18th century, certainly by the second edition in 1716, is suggesting that opium-based medicines are being used rather more extensively. And that the author of a book that is ostensibly, written by the poor man's physician, or intended to be the poor man's physician, does include a number of references to the white poppy substances, the red poppy substances, and opium mixtures like laudanum. So I think we've got a complicated picture here of who exactly is using opium and who exactly has access to opium, to which price would be just one guide. And I should just also perhaps add, to kind of help fill out the picture a little more, from the beginning of and across the 18th century, Scottish merchants are importing opium into Scotland. So we can track imports of medicines fairly regularly into Leith, for example, from the Netherlands, and we can find opium merchants who are buying opium out in the Mediterranean and ultimately end up back in Scotland. So there's opium around, James and Rio. So one would hope that this demonstrates that there is more and more opium around as you proceeded through the period, and therefore increasingly wide access to it.
Fantastic, thanks, Jim. Linda Hendry has pointed out in comments that she can pick red poppies here in Scotland, growing wild until autumn. So they cost. Yep. There we are. Foraging for opiates.
Well, Linda might have something to say about yellow poppies as well, of course, because my wife calls them Welsh poppies for reasons that she can't explain, and I'd never really encountered yellow poppies until I moved to Scotland, where my wife, who's from Leicestershire, identified them as Welsh poppies. So there's another interesting story there. I should maybe have made a clearer conclusion about why this is of interest to early modern historians of medicine, and that is in drawing much closer attention to what exactly is being talked about when the word poppy is mentioned in medical recipes and in apothecaries bills and so on.
Fantastic, thank you, Jim. Questions are backing up, so I'm going to crash on. Jamie, this is a follow-on question, really from Del Rio, relating to the question and thinking particularly about opium and people. Have you got a sense of any similar trends in opium preparations transitioning from a folk medicine to one increasingly regulated by medical professionals in Scotland?
Yeah, I think what becomes interesting as you follow the story through into the 19th century, which are chapters 2 and 3 in the book, and again, from what I recall, because I wrote them a while ago, the story in the 19th century is a familiar one. I think that there's less and less evidence that I can find of rural use, because to a certain extent, what seems to be happening is that the story seems to be emerging from the cities, and this is all about laudanum. So in other words, this is all about patent medicines and the broadening of the patent medicine market for urban consumers. And of course, laudanum gets caught up in all these anxieties about poisoning and urban environments in the 1820s and the 1830s. So if you like, I've got to work harder to find the kinds of evidence that I've been using for the 17th and the 18th centuries. But what happens in the 19th century is the story, and in medical discussions, there's a lot more discussion about laudanum and patent medicines. And of course, in 1802, morphine gets isolated, and the Edinburgh medical elite get really excited about morphine when it starts to come onto the market in the 1820s. So a lot of the medical discussion by the time we get to the 1820s is this kind of medical establishment's rejection of folk medicine and this growing excitement about being able to get their hands on more and more morphine for use in surgery and so on. So I guess what happens is that out in the countryside, people continue to access local preparations of local poppies into the 20th century. I just noticed somebody there's Mark Jenkins just said, we were still using the poppy substances for stomach upsets when he was younger. Kaolin and morphine. Was it kaolin and codeine? But anyway, so I guess that's the story. We've got one of rural use of locally available products, but for the urban population, we've got a story about patent medicines, laudanum, which contain opiates, and for the medical establishment, we've got a rejection of folk medicine in the excitement about modern medicines, and in particular morphine.
Excellent, thank you, Jim, and thank you, Jamie. I hope that answers your question. Our own Dagmar, hi Dagmar, a couple of questions, sort of two really. A, do you have any knowledge about how poppies were conserved, because they have a rather short period of actually blossoming? And B, can you say anything about the interaction between handwritten medical recipes and printed medical treatises? So preservation and interaction between manuscript and printed text.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I'm by no means a botanist or a pharmacologist. So when it comes to preserving poppy, I don't know, and I don't have the evidence from the sources to be able to come up with a sensible answer. But there is, there's lots of evidence that the poppy preparations are being made in advance. So again, you've got this focus on recipes, which are using fresh products, which I guess are then being used when they're readily available and preserved in some of the recipes that I've outlined today. So if you like, the recipe probably serves two functions. The one is to make the opium, to make the whole therapeutic, to make the medicine more effective. But the second purpose, of course, is to preserve the opiates, so it can be used in times of the year when they aren't readily available. And the second question was
about the interaction between sort of manuscript medical recipes and printed medical treatises.
Yeah, I think that's why the Clark family archive was so interesting, because it showed that there's a mix of the two and that the two aren't mutually exclusive. So in other words, what you've got the handwritten materials where I guess there's been some sort of oral exchange where someone's come by and said, well, why don't you try this? We've used it for years, and what's that then? Well, it's poppies and it's honey and it's camphor, and okay, yeah. So someone's written that down. But then what seems to have happened in the Clark archive is that they've written down the syrup of poppies and the recipe and the method of preparing it, and then half a dozen pages later, there's the printed advertisement for Pitcairn's remedy, course of treatment for smallpox. So you can marry the two together and see that there was no, if you like, the oral tradition of passing on medical recipes, and the kind of gathering or the early stages of a medical media. They're not exclusive. Actually, they fit together. So you can imagine a discussion where someone's having a look at Pitcairn's course of treatment and thinking, oh, we probably need some of that. Right, where can I get white poppy syrup from? Well, it's the wrong time of the year to get white poppy syrup, but what's her name next door's got a recipe. I'll go and ask her. And that's where you marry the two bits of documentation together. So again, it's an interesting glimpse of the way in which ideas about medicines and therapies and treatments and diseases combine a kind of oral tradition, which results in the writing down, together with the emergence of a medical media. And I should have said, Pitcairn published that pamphlet, I think less as out of the goodness of his heart, but more because he was trying to win a controversy at the time about how to treat smallpox, which deeply divided the Royal College and the university. Because there was one, I can't quite remember which side he was on, but one side was all for purging and bleeding and all of the traditional horrors. And the other side, which I think Pitcairn was on, was for more enlightened treatment, using medicines and trying to control fevers. So again, you kind of get an idea that Pitcairn, by using so many different opium-based or poppy-based medicines in his pamphlet, he's seeking to use a far more medical approach rather than one based on inflicting treatments upon the body.
Excellent, thank you, Jim, and thank you, Dagmar. Again, moving on, so we've got a few backed up. Gabby asks, also from our German team, thanks you for the fascinating talk, and she's wondering if the opiate recipes generally included sugar in some form or not. Is this perhaps more the case for remedies for children? She wonders if you could tell us a little bit more about the combination of opium and sugar more generally.
Well, I get the impression from the recipes that for those of us who haven't tried it, the combination of opium and sugar is a good thing. And I certainly find that in a large number of these recipes, sugar is being used I think essentially to sweeten products for children. There's a lot of sugar, I think, in Pitcairn's remedy for smallpox, but of course the pamphlet is largely focused on children. But again, I think we need to remember that sugar was itself a commodity like white poppy at this time. It was an exotic product coming from abroad. So if your question is actually about sugar, then yeah, I think you find that sugar is being included in recipes more and more. as you go through this period. If you're asking about sweetening, which is a different question, then I'd need to know more about some of the other products and some of the other plants being used in these recipes, because of course there were a whole range of other ingredients that we used before sugarcane turned up in Europe for sweetening recipes.
Great, thank you, Jim. Nesca Pfeiffer asks, where was the poppy grown or sourced for these recipes in this period?
Oh, well, now that's a good question. I feel a lot safer in answering this. At the beginning of the period, it's so in the 17th century, it's from the Middle East. And you've got Scottish traders who will go off to the Mediterranean and trade their way around the Middle East for 2 or 3 years, eventually ending up back in London and then in Leith, with and exchanging all sorts of products on the way. But we know from a couple of the cases I found at the National Archives of Scotland that, Scottish traders are certainly trading opium in the Middle East. What you find by the end of the 17th and into the 18th century is that opium is being bought in the Netherlands by Scottish traders, because the Dutch East India Company, of course, is expanding its influence in South Asia at this time. And as far as I can tell, and again, somebody out there will tell me I'm entirely wrong, but as far as I can tell, there's a longer tradition of medicinal trade between Scotland and the Netherlands than there is between Scotland and England, or specifically between Edinburgh and London. So when Edinburgh doctors and the university and so on are sourcing medical ingredients from abroad, it's usually from the Netherlands. So you're finding that opium is making its way into Scotland about 1700 from Dutch sources, and Dutch sources are ultimately opium from Asia, which can be very different to opium sourced in the Middle East. And then by the end of the century, of course, they're sourcing opium from everybody from 1707 onwards, of course. Scotland's part of the Union, and everybody's off making money in India. So much of the opium is being sourced from India, but a significant proportion is still being sourced from the Middle East. And finally, there's various experiments in the first couple of decades of the 20th century with growing opium in Scotland. In fact, Virginia Merriges mentions John Young, who was trying to grow opium out in North Lanarkshire, for those of you, those West Coasters who are listening in today. And needless to say, didn't enjoy much success. But there was a little bit more success out towards somewhere in East Lothian. But I think by the end of the 1820s, Scots had given up trying to grow opium at home for fairly obvious climatic reasons.
Brilliant, thank you, Jim. And just sort of sticking with the theme of global exchanges of commodities and ideas, Siobhan Lambert-Hurley had a question in comments next, I think. She wonders if any of these recipes drew on medical expertise within Asia, especially perhaps from Ayurvedic or Unani practitioners. She's aware of cookbooks in India, especially containing recipes for these kinds of medical preparations.
Yeah, again, it's a question that's spot on, Siobhan. But really, I think the story of, if you like, this kind of global exchange of ideas about psychoactive medicines and about intoxicants really only gathers pace at the end of the 18th century, and is kind of really gathers pace in the early decades of the 19th century. So this is certainly a key element of the story of the introduction of opium and opiates into Europe. But up in Scotland, there's very little evidence that there's any direct sharing or gathering of intelligence in either Asia or the Middle East of opium recipes. But what we do certainly find is that from the 1760s and 1770s onwards, if you like, Scots doctors or Scots explorers working in Asia start to bring back all sorts of ideas, not just about opium, of course, but about cannabis as well, which the Scottish medical establishment are very excited about in the first few decades of the 19th century.
Excellent, thank you, Jim. Thank you, our own Phil with a question, great stuff. The 16th and 17th century writers were very clear about the unusual and dangerous potency of opium coming from the white poppy, including when compared to the red poppy. And he's wondering about the significance of this for your argument about the interchangeability of red and white poppies therapeutically or indeed recreationally.
Yeah. I think I rushed through a point at the end, which I think was that my argument is that a familiarity with what's the word I'm looking for? It's the wrong word, but the familiarity with using the less potent, I suppose, or the weaker red poppy meant that physicians were keenly aware or druggists and apothecaries were keenly aware of the significantly enhanced potency of the white poppy, hence those warnings that, look, these things aren't the same, and we're aware that they're not the same, and we've established that they're not the same. And therefore, they were quite clear, or increasingly clear, in these recipes and the advice given, when they should be using white poppy syrups, when they should be using red poppy syrups, when they should be using laudanum, and so on. So, and that was part of the story I hadn't expected when I first started working around this. It really only dawned on me that there was the story about white poppies there was a second story behind it, which was a story about red poppies and the ways in which Scots medical practitioners and there's a whole separate discussion in the book about Scots medical elites, researchers, really, digging down into and trying to work out what the differences were between all of these plants and trying to work out the differences between the preparations that could be made in them, and so on. So I think you're right. By the time you get to the 18th century, the doctors and apothecaries are becoming ever more careful to explain exactly what needs to be prepared and exactly how it needs to be prepared and exactly when it should be used.
Okay, 3 more minutes left. 2 questions in the box, so rapid fire answers, please, Jim, if you can. I'll ask them very quickly as well.
Yep.
Eduardo says, thanks for the wonderful presentation. He doesn't know about the Scottish background, but in his work published in 1600, English physician Dr. John Jones was probably the first to recognise a, quote, kind of pleasure in the use of opiates, comparing it to the recreational use of alcohol. How about its impact in Scotland? Do you find any clue of the development of iatrogenic addiction among opium users? Perhaps as one of your authors hinted.
Again, no, but I certainly think that's the quotes. That's what may lie behind the rather veiled discussion that I touched on right at the end there in the Campbell family. This allusion to the idea that if opium painkillers are introduced, then it will be necessary to continue with them.
Mm-hmm.
Again, it's a veiled reference in a discussion between brother and brother-in-law about a sister-in-law. So it's necessarily going to be delicately worded. But that is, but the reason I ended on that is that really is the only piece of evidence I've found of a discussion around the unintended consequences of using opium medicines that I've been able to come across. Now, whether that's because the evidence is out there, I've simply not found it, or whether that's because there's no evidence of what may have been an emerging practice of using opium substances for non-medical purposes, it's difficult to say. And it may also be that the Scots were late to discovering the pleasures of using opium substances. But I look forward to the next generation of researchers tripping me up on that.
Brilliant, thank you, Jim. Last question. As most of the opium grew in the Middle East, I guess it must be Iran and the Levant mostly. Did you come across any recipes referring to the medical usage as instructed by Islamic physicians, such as Avicenna?
Yeah, no, not at this point. And again, I touched on this to an earlier question. You start to find that sort of discussion, not just about the use of opiates and cannabis, but also about ancient uses of opium and cannabis once you get into the 19th century.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jim. And we're going to unfortunately have to wrap things up here before we all turn into pumpkins or opium poppies. But it remains for me to say thanks so much, Jim, for an absolutely fascinating talk and brilliant responses and Q&A. And thanks so much to all of you as well for coming along, and indeed for your support for the What's Your Poison series as a whole, which has been absolutely fantastic. This was the last instalment of this season, as I mentioned, but we have 6 more amazing speakers lined up for season 2, which will take place in the same slot between January and March next year. Now, unfortunately, GDPR rules mean I can't email you about this, but do keep an eye on our website and also our social media, where we'll be posting details very early in the new year. So yeah, thanks to you, and thanks so much again, Jim, for closing out this season in such fine style. Thanks, everyone. Cheers now.
Happy Christmas, everyone.
Bye.